The Siren's call was a relic from another era, a grand cruise ship now showing its age, with tarnished brass fixtures and frayed carpets. It still sets sail twice a year, offering passengers a slower, nostalgic journey across the Atlantic. But the crew knew something about the ship that the passengers didn't. There was a ghost on board, a restless spirit known only as the passenger. Emily and her boyfriend Jason booked the trip for a quiet getaway, expecting sunsets on the deck and long, lazy days at sea. On their first night, after dinner in the ballroom, they overheard some of the crew whispering about strange happenings. A bartender mentioned the ship's ghost with a nervous chuckle. "A woman," he said, polishing a glass. "People see her in strange places, soaking wet like she's just climbed out of the ocean." Jason rolled his eyes. "Bet they say that to freak people out." Emily tried to laugh along, but something about the bartender's tone unsettled her. The weirdness began the next night. After a few drinks at the bar, Emily and Jason decided to head back to their cabin on Deck 5. The ship's old elevator rattled and groaned as they stepped inside. Jason pressed the button for their floor, and the doors closed with a heavy thud. But instead of rising, the elevator lurched, the lights flickering. It shuddered to a stop on Deck 1, the ship's lowest level, used only for storage and maintenance. Jason frowned. "What the hell? This deck isn't even supposed to be accessible." The elevator doors slid open slowly, revealing a dimly lit corridor. A sharp, briny smell hung in the air, and a draft of cold wind swept into the elevator, chilling Emily to the bone. "Let's go back up," she whispered, her voice tight. Jason nodded and frantically pressed the button for Deck 5. But before the doors could close, they both saw something at the far end of the corridor. A woman. She wore a soaked white dress that clung to her skin, her dark hair draped over her face, dripping water onto the floor. Though the hallway was silent, her presence radiated a deep, unnatural stillness, as if the ship itself held its breath. Jason hit the closed door button repeatedly, but the elevator wouldn't respond. The woman began walking toward them, her movements slow and deliberate. "Come on!" Jason hissed, pounding the button. The elevator doors groaned shut just as the woman reached them. As the elevator ascended with a lurch, Emily stood frozen, her heart pounding. "Who the hell was that?" Jason whispered, his face pale. Emily shook her head. I don't think she was alive." That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She lay in the narrow cabin bed, listening to the hum of the ship's engines and the faint creaks of the old vessel shifting on the water. Jason slept soundly beside her, but Emily's nerves were frayed. Emily sat up slowly, her skin prickling with fear. In the faint glow from the porthole, she saw something standing at the foot of the bed. It was the woman from the elevator. Her white dress dripped seawater onto the carpet. Her hair hung over her face, but Emily could see her lips moving, as if whispering something. No sound came from her mouth, only the dripping of water. Emily reached out to shake Jason awake, but before she could, the woman raised a trembling hand and pointed toward the porthole. Emily's gaze followed the direction of the gesture, and what she saw outside made her heart seize. Pressed against the glass, just beyond the thin barrier separating them from the ocean, were dozens of faces. Pale, bloated faces, their empty eyes staring in at her. Their mouths opened and closed silently, as if calling out from the depths below. Emily tried to scream, but no sound came out. The woman at the foot of the bed leaned closer, her wet hair brushing against Emily's arm. Her mouth twisted into a shape that was almost a smile. And then, without warning, she disappeared, along with the faces outside the porthole. Jason stirred beside her, groggy. "What's wrong?" Emily sat frozen, her heart hammering in her chest. "We need to get off this ship," she whispered. The next morning, Emily and Jason went to the purser's desk, demanding to know if anyone else had reported strange events. But the crew denied everything, insisting there were no problems aboard the ship. Later that day, Emily overheard two crew members talking in hushed tones. "They saw her again," one of them said. "The passenger." "How long until she takes someone this time?" the other asked, voice grim. Emily felt her stomach drop. As the ship sailed farther from land, things grew worse. Passengers began to disappear without explanation. First, a couple from the pool deck, then a man who'd been sitting alone in the dining room the night before. The missing were never found. Their cabins were untouched, their belongings still neatly packed away, as if they had never been there at all. By the fifth night, the ship felt empty, abandoned. Emily and Jason stayed in their cabin, too terrified to venture out. They locked the door, but the chill never left the room, and the sound of dripping water was constant. At midnight, Emily woke to the sound of footsteps outside their door, slow, deliberate steps. Jason sat up beside her, his face pale with fear. "Do you hear that?" Emily nodded. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Then came the knocking, 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Jason stood, his hand shaking as he reached for the doorknob. "Don't," Emily whispered, grabbing his arm, but Jason pulled away. "We need to see who it is." He unlocked the door and pulled it open, revealing the woman in the white dress standing in the corridor. Her hair dripped seawater onto the floor, and her lifeless eyes stared straight through them. Before either of them could react, she reached out and touched Jason's arm. His body stiffened, his eyes rolling back into his head. Water began to pour from his mouth as if his lungs had filled with the ocean. Emily screamed as Jason collapsed to the floor, lifeless. The woman smiled, then turned and walked slowly down the corridor, disappearing into the shadows. The Siren's call docked a few days later, but not everyone made it home. Emily told the authorities what happened, but no one believed her. There were no records of Jason ever boarding the ship. His name wasn't on the passenger manifest, and his belongings were gone from the cabin. It was as if he had never existed. The crew refused to talk, and the ship sailed again, its hulls waiting for the next unsuspecting passengers. But deep within the Siren's call, the ghost of the woman in white waited.